I'm sitting down today with Mike Pieciak, Vermont State Treasurer. Treasurer Pieciak was inaugurated as Vermont's 31st state treasurer in January 2023. He previously served 6 years as the commissioner of the Vermont Department of Financial Regulation, and during the pandemic, he served on the COVID-19 pandemic response team. Now, Treasurer Pieciak currently sits on the board of Outright Vermont, an LGBTQ+ youth and support empowerment organization, and resides in Winooski with his husband Will and English setter Jetty. This is one very special episode, and you certainly won't want to miss it. This is Vermont's Voice. Well, Treasurer Pieciak, thank you so much for being here. It is truly a privilege, and welcome to Vermont's Voice.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Really excited to just dive into our conversation today. So I plan to just kind of skip right through the small talk because there's a lot I want to dig into. And while we will get to some of the specific pieces of the policy and the programs that you're working on, I do think it makes sense to zoom out for just a moment for me and for our listeners. Could you possibly tell us what it's like to be a state treasurer? What does that day-to-day look like for you?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think it's changed a lot in the last 3 months or so since we've had a new federal administration.
Yes.
You know, when I first came into office, we had some goals that we wanted to accomplish in the legislature. We wanted to establish this program called Vermont Saves. We wanted to expand the amount of housing we're investing in Vermont. So we had some real sort of concrete goals, and we're really proud that we're able to accomplish those. But when you have things like that, when you have a legislative policy or you have a new internal policy that you're trying to create, you have to dedicate a lot of time to those to make sure they happen and to make sure they happen the way that you want. So that was a lot of my time, early on getting into office. Some of it was getting to know the people in our team as well, the people that work in our treasurer's office and have for their whole career. And then getting to know the role a little bit too, not just the new things that you want to get done, but the important things that the office sort of annually or regularly has to do to make sure we're managing the money and investing money on behalf of Vermonters, in smart ways. So every day is a little bit different. There's really not a lot of consistency. We could be traveling within state. We could be working from home. We could be here in Montpelier. It feels like it is a pretty, every day comes with its own unique challenge. But in the last 3 months, it's been a different world. I mean, we just have had so much come at the state of Vermont in terms of fast changing federal policy that it's taken a lot of time to sort of be focused on that, analyze it, try to understand what the impact is, what Vermont can do to, lessen the impact and what we need to be doing to prepare for what might be coming next.
Gotcha. So it's keeping you plenty busy.
Yeah, no doubt.
Gotcha. Well, we'll talk about some of what you've mentioned there, especially on the federal side. But first, I'd love it if we could talk treasure, or more officially, unclaimed property.
Oh, yeah.
So according to your database, there are over 1 million properties valued at more than $130 million. And my understanding is that these are assets that are sort of just waiting around for their rightful owners, sort of collecting dust, if you will. So clearly, these folks don't know that they have these assets waiting for them.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how one might go about finding out if they have unclaimed property and how they can actually retrieve it.
Yeah, so the best way for someone to take a look is a website called missingmoney.com. Mm-hmm. So missingmoney.com is not just the state of Vermont's database. It has all of the treasurer's offices across the country that manage unclaimed property. It all feeds into that website. So if you lived in West Virginia or California and you thought maybe you have unclaimed property there, or you have relatives or friends that live in those states, you can go to missingmoney.com and search, universally. So that's really the best place to check. We also have been trying to be more proactive about automatically returning money to individuals. We had a pilot program 2 years ago that turned into a full-fledged program this year that automatically returned about $1.2 million to 5,000 Vermonters. We were able to send our data to the tax department, match up the data that was consistent, verify their information, get the most recent mailing address for them from the tax department, and then send them a letter saying you can expect a check in the amount of X amount of money. Oh, wow. And then we sent them the check as well. So we like to do that because despite all of our best efforts to have earned media and paid media and talk about unclaimed property. Most people aren't unaware of it, and they don't go to the website, unfortunately. So the money sits there. So this is a way of us to try to be more proactive and get it back in their pocket.
Well, that's great. And I hope our listeners take you up on that and check it out. I did check that website recently. Sadly, I had no missing money, but
Well, you should always recheck. That's the other thing, because we get new monies in every year, and it actually comes in, a business that has to turn money over to us. They're required to do it every year by May 1st. So we will have a lot of unclaimed property in our system over the next couple of months. So people should check this summer.
Good to know. I'll get back on that site too. All right. So during your campaign, you mentioned that your top 3 priorities were housing, climate, and rebuilding the middle class. As far as I can tell in all of my research, you've done a great job of all 3 of those things so far. But I'd like to stick with housing for just a moment. We'll get into all of it. But through the expansion of the 10% in Vermont program that you mentioned a little bit earlier, you committed to supporting the construction of over 1,100 new housing units. Now, I imagine that takes quite a long time to establish and to get all of those houses up in Vermont. But I'm wondering if you could give us some sort of progress report.
Yeah.
How is that going?
Yeah, so far so good from my perspective. We announced maybe about 2 years ago that this money was available. And I should back up and mention why we made it available. When you talk to businesses, you talk to Vermonters, the number one issue that comes up is either affordability, which to me really means housing, because the number one thing we spend money on is housing. And when people are having a hard time finding housing, or having a hard time paying for their rent, or having a hard time buying their first home, it's often because we don't have an abundance of housing. We have a shortage of housing that's causing prices to go up. So I always think that affordability is the sort of housing issue. But oftentimes people will mention housing specifically. They can't hire more workers because those workers can't find housing. Young people can't afford to live here. They decide to move somewhere else that's more affordable to them. So it's a real issue that we have to tackle. And I think it's one that has broad bipartisan support. It's just good for individuals. It's good for the economy. We obviously have to build the housing in the right places in the right way to preserve what I would think of as the Vermont advantage, like how our natural beauty of our state, our outdoor recreational opportunities, the environment that we live in that makes Vermont unique. But I don't think those things are in conflict with each other. I think they can both happen simultaneously. So we knew we needed more housing. And then you talk about what's the biggest impediment. And one of the biggest impediments is simply the cost of building more housing. One of the big impediments was interest rates. Interest rates were really high.
Yep.
So a lot of projects that we spoke with in 2022, when I ran for treasurer, 2023, they would say, supply costs have caused our project to go up 15 or 20%. And at the high interest rates, we can't finance that increased cost and have the project still make sense. So we decided we wanted to expand the amount that we were investing up to $100 million. Now it's $115 million. Wow. We wanted to dedicate it to housing. But the other important piece is we wanted to provide it at a below market interest rate so that we could make it easier for these projects to go forward. So a great example, and it's the first project that we funded, and it's actually up and running now within 18 months, which is we're really happy about. But it's this project in Vergennes called Vergennes Grand, and it's an assisted living facility. They had about 18 units to begin with. They wanted to expand it by an additional 65 units or so. It's for moderate and low-income Vermonters. They accept Vermonters on Medicaid, which is somewhat unusual for that kind of facility. And it's right in downtown Vergennes. It's downtown, densely built. Great for the people that are moving into it. It's a beautiful facility, but also it's opening up housing within the community as well as people are leaving their homes and coming into this sort of centrally safe, secure, and affordable housing unit. But when they talked to us, they said their project cost like $17 or $18 million before the pandemic. And post-pandemic, it was going to cost $24 million.
Wow.
It was about a $5 million increase. And they said, with that increase, that doesn't work with the financing at the high interest rates that are available to us. So by providing that low cost capital of $5 million at a couple, 1.5%, 2.5% interest rate, the project was able to go forward, and we were able to sort of ride out this period of time with high interest rates while also building housing. So that was why that was so important to us.
Wow. All right. Well, that's a pretty good update. So thanks for that.
And I should mention we have 31 other housing investments across Vermont.
Wow.
So they're all in a period of groundbreaking or construction or even completion as well. So we expect to do a little bit of a housing tour this summer to sort of check in on those investments and create a summary of where they all are. But I think we're well on our way to meeting the goals that we set 2 years ago.
Great. That's amazing news. And
Yeah.
thank you for your work on that. Hugely important, as you know. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and we'll get into something slightly heavier. So sorry to bring down the mood just a bit there. But since January, there have been some sort of obvious challenges brought on by federal action, which, we alluded to earlier. But you've convened a task force to assess economic impact of the new administration on Vermont's economy, which is hugely important. So glad you're working on that. And you also recently took part in 2 town hall meetings to meet with community members and to talk about some of the most pressing issues, right? So things like layoffs, tariffs, funding freezes, immigration, probably a lot more than that too.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to lift those 2 things up and also mention that I found it interesting that 36% of Vermont's budget actually comes from federal money and 76% of Vermont's imports come from Canada.
Yeah.
So that's my very long-winded introduction to my question, which is, with constant threats of federal freezing and defunding, along with our country's newly fractured relationship with Canada, I'm wondering what can be done to protect Vermont's economy and community over the next 4 years.
Yeah. Well, just to start with the broad question of like, what is it about Vermont's economy that I worry about relative to the federal action, just to take a broad stance on it. And you mentioned one of them, which is the amount of trade that we conduct with Canada and the relationship that we have with Canada. The other is that amount of money that we get from the federal government. We're highly dependent on the federal government there. Much of that money that comes to us is to work in partnership on programs that the federal government requires states to operate, like Medicaid. So we're in partnership on that. They're sending us the money to execute on a policy that the federal government has. So it's not like we're, just taking this money and sort of doing what we want with it. So I think that's important for Vermonters to know. And then I think about 1 in 5 Vermonters that work for a nonprofit. It's a significant percentage of our economy. It's a big contributor to our economy. Yeah, exactly right. And, a lot of those nonprofits are dependent on federal grants. And a lot of those nonprofits are so dependent on federal grants that if they did not get them, there would be a serious question about whether they could continue to operate, certainly at the extent that they do. And then the other one is FEMA funding. We're highly dependent on the federal government. We're the 4th, I think it is now, per capita in terms of the amount of federal funding that's come to Vermont over the last 15 years to help us recover after a natural disaster. And that's an area where the federal government has a lot of discretion. The president himself has a lot of discretion to declare a major disaster declaration. So I worry about those 4 things. I mean, there are other states that have some of those same challenges, but I think those are 4, in combination, those are 4 unique challenges for us. And on the Canadian point in particular, we have a lot of trade and we have a lot of tourism. On the tourism front, we've heard from a lot of businesses in the Northeast Kingdom and in Northern Vermont that Canadians are calling and saying, we're not coming this summer. We'll see you in 4 years. We'll see you when you have a new president. And that can have a big impact on Vermont. It could have a big impact in more rural parts of the state where a lot of Quebec and Canadian tourists go, like Kingdom Trails in Burke or Jay Peak up in Newport and Troy. So we worry about that. Visitations from Canada, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of visitations every year into Vermont, millions and millions of dollars spent. So I think one of the things we have to keep trying to do as a state is differentiate ourselves from Vermont to the United States. Yep. That Vermont is still a place worth visiting, a place that we have shared values with our Canadian neighbors, that it's important we continue to strengthen those relationships and continue to support each other, that we visit them, that they visit us, and that that is more important in the long run than, avoiding each other for the next 4 years. So I think we have to think about ways that we can differentiate ourselves from what's happening nationally.
Got it. Sounds like we're still probably figuring that out.
Yeah.
I think at least getting somewhere to start is important, and you've acknowledged, recognized what's going on. And I imagine that's very heavy to have to sit with among all the other things that you're doing with. So,
yeah, no doubt. I mean, it's a real challenge. I mean, one of the challenges on the front about the economy is we may be in a situation where we just have less federal funding, right? So That's an issue. We have nonprofits that don't have the same funding. Maybe Medicaid is cut and we don't have the same amount of funding there. Maybe the federal government doesn't give us the same amount of FEMA reimbursement as we've expected in the past. So we're dealing with a reduction in federal spending, but at the same time, we also may be seeing a recession that seems more likely by the day, particularly after yesterday's announcement. And when there's a recession, the state of Vermont has not growing revenues, but decreasing revenues. So we may be confronted with these gaps in federal funding and at the same time having a reduction in state revenues, which will make it even harder for us to manage that process. So that really is a worst case scenario from my perspective. And we got to be, we got to have it on our radar, and we have to be thinking through what do we do and what happens if that day comes.
Yeah, we'll have to do some creative thinking.
Yeah, no doubt.
All right. Well, switching gears a bit, but not too awful much, I want to talk about climate, which is another sort of pillar of your priorities and something that we know is also being affected by federal funding. So the legislature tasked the Treasurer's Office with coordinating the state's climate infrastructure financing efforts, which I think is great. So happy you're taking that on. I'm biased, but still. And so what that means is a convening of national and local leaders from all across sectors to secure and deploy federal funding for various resilience projects. So again, noting and acknowledging that we have some challenges that we're facing right now with the federal government, I'm wondering if we are making any progress on local climate infrastructure funding. Yep. Are we better prepared for the next big flood?
Yeah. So I think there's some good news there, right? This is sort of a mixture of good and bad. Start with the good since we had a lot of bad. But if you think back about, Hurricane or Tropical Storm Irene and the damage that inflicted on Vermont, in terms of the amount of roadways that were washed away, culverts that were washed out, bridges that were destroyed, homes that were destroyed. And then you look at the flooding from 2023 and 2024, but we had significantly less road damage, we had significantly less bridge damage, significantly less culverts washed out. Different parts of the state were impacted more heavily than during Irene. So, there's some parts that were hit even harder. But overall, we made a lot of investments between Irene and 2023, and it seemed like a lot of those paid off. I think there are a couple of good examples here in Montpelier and things that we can learn from. But there was a new build downstreet housing, built-in affordable housing unit that really couldn't be any closer to the river. I mean, it's really close to the Winooski River. But when the river flooded, they built their building up high so that they didn't experience any flooding damage or very minimal. The motor vehicle department, DMV, it's an old building that's right on State Street. They insulated and waterproofed that building over the last few years. Our building that we work out of is further away from the river. We had damage that kept us out of the building for 10 months, but the DMV sustained almost no damage, again, closer to the river than our building. So it shows the ways we can build resiliency into the physical buildings that we're building, whether they're new or new build. And that gives me some hope, like we can figure this out. And we are working on a resiliency implementation strategy in connection with the governor's office to try to set up a strategy for the next decade about how do we prioritize resiliency, how do we fund it, how do we finance it, and that will be set to be announced in July of this year. So, right, coming up pretty quickly. Great. The thing about that was a little bit less great news was these convenings that we were having, which were great. We had great participation, great discussion. They were all building toward the monies that would be available under the IRA and the federal monies that are available more broadly. And just a lot of those funds have just stopped. The anticipation of funding coming for climate, CO2 reduction, and resiliency has sort of frozen, which is discouraging, of course. So what we do in Vermont, what we do on resiliency almost takes a even more important focus now.
Absolutely. And I feel like this is a good point to bring up Vermont's new Climate Superfund law.
Yeah.
Which, just as a reminder for our listeners, it's this idea that we can hold big oil and gas companies accountable financially for their fair share of the climate crisis. And that funding could go into some of these resiliency projects that we're talking about. And so as treasurer, it would be your role to sort of use that attribution science to divvy out those costs to those big oil and gas companies. Is that something that is still on your radar? Have you started doing that? Is there just too much going on federally? I just would love to hear where you're at in that process.
So we, our part in that is to sort of, as you point out, come up with the cost, like how much does climate change cost Vermont? Looking backward, let's call it 2 or 3 decades, and then looking forward into the future. And if you think about Vermont's sort of iconic industries, skiing, maple sugaring, fall foliage, agriculture broadly, like they're all highly dependent on our unique climate. Snow for skiing is obvious, I think. Foliage, though, is a very unique combination of how the weather is in the fall that creates the bright, beautiful colored maple leaves. Same with sugaring in terms of how the maple sap flows. And then agriculture, we have these false springs where things start to grow and then there's a frost that kills everything, or torrential rain that's more frequent now that wipes out crops as well. So climate change has put directly in its bullseye all of these iconic Vermont industries on top of the flooding that we've experienced and all of the things that we're going to have to invest in to make sure we can mitigate against that. So we know the cost is going to be significant for what we've already experienced and what we're going to need to do going forward to build a more resilient Vermont. And then, as you point out, the questions like who's going to pay for that? Is it Vermonters? Is it federal taxpayers through FEMA? Or is it the companies that have caused this to happen in the first place? So we issued an RFI, a request for information, with the Agency of Natural Resources, requesting feedback on how would we go about doing our work, how would the Agency of Natural Resources go about doing their work. We got good feedback. Certainly our expectation is that what we're charged with doing is possible to do. There are some elements of climate that have a longer academic history, like the impact of heat on a particular community. Sea rise is a well-studied area. The kind of flooding we have in Vermont, though, as you know, is more, valleys that have been flooded by rain in sort of mountainous areas where the rain and milt comes into the valley, and then we see that kind of flooding rather than sea rise flooding. And the information that we got was that's certainly possible to model and to account for, but it hadn't yet been done. So we believe we just need a little bit more time, a little bit more money to make sure we get that right. And that's sort of the period that we're at now. We expect to issue an RFP. So not just a request for information about how we would do this, but actual proposals from consultants or academics or others to tell us how they would do it and to give us a proposal that we can sort of analyze and decide whom we would want to partner with.
All right. Well, that's a good update. No immediate bad news, so I'm going to hold on to that. That's awesome. And I'd love it if we could just maybe have a little fun.
Yeah.
Should we do a quick game? Break up these hard-hitting conversations. I'm wondering if we could play a round of District Delights, which is where I'll give you the opportunity to talk about some of your local favorites, but in your district, which is funny because your district is the entire state of Vermont. So I think this will be pretty interesting. But if you're game,
sounds good.
I have some questions for you. So let's play a round of District Delights with Treasurer Mike Pieciak. All right. Could you start by telling me about a place to build or connect with community?
Yeah. So I grew up in Brattleboro, and in Brattleboro, the place that we would always connect as a community when I was growing up was really our downtown and like the entire Main Street.
Yep.
There were a lot of businesses that we all knew the owners by name. We would frequent them. We would go to community events downtown. We saw a lot of my friends that we'd go downtown. And it really kind of, I think of it as sort of like a almost bucolic way of growing up in Vermont. But I think it also instilled in me this real strong importance of our city centers and our downtowns, and that we need to make sure we maintain them. And in many ways, it makes us unique about Vermont, that sense of community. So I always got the community from that sort of central place where everybody came to have dinner or take a walk, go shopping. We've lost some of that a little bit in some of our towns, particularly like the town I grew up in Brattleboro, but it is, I think, what made it unique growing up here.
That's great. Thanks for sharing. All right. What about a unique stop on the campaign trail?
Well, we always like the stops that involved like creamies or new ice creams.
Yes. Creamy season is coming.
Yeah. So one place that we went to in Manchester was this place, Wilcox, and they have these things called an 802 bar, which you can only find in some parts of the state, and they're really good. So we always tried to find a store that would have an 802 bar. And we knew we were in southern Vermont when we would
taking a note of that.
There's one that's like maple cream, I think. I think that's their best one. But when you find an 802 bar, you say, oh, we're close to home or whatever. And but we found this place, Wilcox, that was the original site of the farm where they had the milk to make the ice cream. And they have like a little stand that's in like a bus or something. So a little bit off the beaten track, but just north of the city of Manchester, town of Manchester.
I love that, and it sounds delightful. So I'm going to have to add it to my own personal list. All right, what about a favorite Vermont day trip destination?
Yeah, well, my favorite is, and still is Burton Island, which is, up in Lake Champlain. And why it's interesting to me is it's like you have to take the ferry to get to it, the state-run ferry. So you show up, with your stuff for however long you're staying. You can stay overnight on the island.
Oh, cool.
But I usually go with my dog, and we just go for a day or like a couple hours. You go out on the ferry, you have all the stuff that you got to bring with you. There's a lot of people out on the island. It's pretty remote, so you can sort of walk around and not be too disturbed. And Jetty, my dog, likes it, a lot of chipmunks and things like that.
That sounds so nice. No one's bothering you for autographs.
Yeah.
It's so remote.
Well, most of them are Canadian, which goes back to a lot of them take their boats down and dock at Burton Island. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I had no idea that this was even a place. So
So I didn't know either, but I came back to Vermont, and it was like 10 years ago, and I was in what they call an LCAR committee, so Legislative Rules Committee, and I was there with some rule from our Department of Financial Regulation, but
Wow.
Fish and Wildlife were there before me, and they were talking about raising the rate on the Burton Island ferry. I was like, what are they talking about?
What is this?
So I looked into it, and I was like, this is really cool.
Oh, sweet. All right, cool. Thanks for sharing. All right. What about a place to enjoy Vermont's great outdoors, aside from maybe what you just referenced?
Yeah. So the other place that I always liked hanging out at is the Dorset Quarry down in Dorset, Vermont. So it's an old quarry that is right on the road. It's like right on Route 7, I think it is. And nobody knows how deep it is. It goes forever. So I don't do it, but I've had friends that have gone to the 100-foot mark and jump down and do somersaults and all that stuff. And it's safe because there's nothing.
Wow.
There's no bottom. I mean, the bottom's 100 feet or more, even below. But it's a cool place in the summer. There's a lot of people hang out there. And, it's a fun. If you grew up in southern Vermont, it was a place that you would travel to hang out.
That's awesome. Yeah, we've got some pretty cool quarries in Berry City.
Yeah.
I'll have to check those out as well.
Can you swim in those?
I don't think so.
Yeah, so this way the Dorset Quarry is really kind of unique.
Yeah, I think yours is probably better. All right, and what about the best way to spend a Winooski day?
Oh, Winooski. So, there's a couple of good, although they're smaller, but there are a couple of good hiking, walking trails in Winooski that are fun to hang out on. If we're running short on time, that's sort of where I take my dog for a walk. There's a lot of good restaurants. Onion City Chicken and Oyster is a favorite. They have great fried chicken and great oysters. My favorite brewery is Four Quarters.
That's a good one.
Yeah, they're great. They have a beer called Phase, which is an IPA, which continues to be my favorite beer. Sometimes you go through cycles of liking different things, and that's true for me with different IPAs. But this Phase has been my favorite for 10 years, or sorry, 5 years. It's great.
Cool. I'll give it a try.
Yeah.
I'm not typically a big beer drinker, but I will try this. So those are the questions that I have. Is there anything I'm missing that you want to lift up really quickly? It's okay if not.
Well, geez, I don't know. Let's see. I mean, I think Vermont, and I think the thing that's great is so many of the communities in the Northeast Kingdom, in Central Vermont, Southern Vermont, they all have this unique element to them. They have unique restaurants. They have unique coffee shops, unique sort of local attractions. So when I ran for treasurer, we visited every single town in Vermont, all 251 towns. And I just had a fully new appreciation for how unique every part of the state is, but how beautiful every part of the state is, and encourage Vermonters to get out and, take vacation right here in Vermont. There's a lot to explore.
Try it all.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to do. All right, great. Well, thank you for playing. I have just a few more questions for you, so we'll get back into that. Pivoting really hard now to healthcare. It's hard to do after this really pleasant conversation, but with the rising costs of healthcare, many Vermonters are unable or unwilling to seek the care that they need because they are afraid that they simply can't afford it. As you likely know, many of us are just one medical emergency away from sort of financial distress in a real way. But this is something you're aware of and working on, which I am so grateful for. And you have a proposed medical debt relief program that I'm excited to hear more about. And just also want to lift up that this would not impose new taxes, fees, or costs, which I think is also incredible. So I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you mentioned earlier, Jordan, like the things that I ran on housing, climate resiliency, and investing in the middle class. I really see this as investing in the middle class. It would be focused on moderate and low income Vermonters who have medical debt. We know medical debt's the number one reason for personal bankruptcy in the United States. We know that Vermont has the highest healthcare costs in the country. You look just at Vermont relative to New Hampshire for our ACA plans, our marketplace plans. They're basically half as expensive in even a place like New Hampshire or Maine. So we have high healthcare costs, and we don't have the highest median incomes in that country. So we have this gap between our healthcare costs and what a median average Vermonter is earning. And then that unfortunately has gotten wider. So when that happens, you're more likely to end up in medical debt. So we have to certainly work on the underlying problem of our healthcare system. But this is a really important step to be able to forgive about $100 million is the expectation, $100 million of medical debt with the one-time relatively small investment of $1 million. So it'd be focusing on older medical debt that Vermonters that, again, are moderate, medium, low income hold. And there's a couple of goals here. One is certainly financial. People may be held back in terms of getting credit. They may be held back in terms of the interest rate that they're paying for the credit because they have this debt. And we want to be able to wipe that clean. But there's also this sort of other side that's really important too, which is the behavioral side. So when people have medical debt, they're less likely to go seek care. They are willing to forego care for some period of time or maybe altogether because they're feeling ashamed about having medical debt. They're worried that their provider will not see them because they owe them medical debt, or they may just be worried about accumulating even more medical debt. So we noticed that a few other states were, I think, doing an innovative solution to this. They were buying older medical debt and then forgiving it and notifying the individuals that the debt had been forgiven. There's a nonprofit called Undo Medical Debt that's been working with a handful of states. That's who we would want to work with and partner with on this. So we came with a proposal this legislative session. Senator Ginny Lyons and Senator Ann Cummings were the co-sponsors on the Senate side, but we had 22 co-sponsors in total. It passed out of the Senate unanimously. It's now in the House. And we have Chair Alyssa Black as the lead co-chair on that. And we're excited that it's being met with such support, and we want to continue to make sure we make that case in the House. But we're also excited that it's met with bipartisan support, because it really should be a bipartisan issue. So, knock on wood, it'll get through the House and signed by the governor. And by the end of this year, we would be under contract with Undo Medical Debt, who would then start negotiating with hospitals and other providers that hold this debt and being able to purchase it really for almost a penny on the dollar. And that's the great part about this is it really is a low-cost program, but it has a big impact in terms of both the financial impact and also those behavioral health impacts as well.
Yeah, absolutely. My fingers are crossed for you. I hope this passes into law. I think it would be truly transformative.
And 60,000 Vermonters, so it impacted a lot of people. So
wow,
big deal.
Yeah, huge deal. I don't know how you have the time to work on all of these various programs, but I'm so grateful.
We had a good team at the Treasurer's office.
Good. Happy to hear that. And speaking of other important programs, in June of 2024, the legislature authorized your office to create the Baby Bonds Pilot Program. Now, you've mentioned that this aims to address intergenerational poverty, rural economic development, and the retention of young people in Vermont. How could this program accomplish all of these things?
Well, that's what got me so interested in it, because it took a minute to sort of understand it and what it was trying to accomplish. But once I sort of got comfortable with it, I said, these are some of the things we're working on that are the most important issues in Vermont. Inequality in terms of wealth distribution, rural economic development, and keeping young people in Vermont. And to have a policy that sort of focuses on all three of those, I think is great. So the Baby Bonds program, as it's designed, would invest money in every child that's born into poverty in Vermont. The proposal was $3,200, and then that would be set aside and invested by our office for them until they reached the age of adulthood, 18 years old through 30 years old. And then they could claim their baby bond, which at that time would have grown to, $15,000, $16,000, $17,000 if they took it on the earlier side, or maybe closer to $30,000 if they waited to 30 years old. And they could buy a house in Vermont. They could start a business or invest in a business in Vermont. They could go to school or higher education, or roll it over into their retirement. So it's focused on combating generational poverty by giving people born into poverty the assets, the opportunity for wealth creating assets that they otherwise wouldn't have. And it does it in a way that allows them to afford to stay and build a life here in Vermont, to start that business, to buy their first home. So that's a really important part of the program. But we also know that more people are born into poverty in rural parts of the state than in our more urban areas. So it does have this benefit of helping places like the Kingdom or Southern Vermont in a disproportionate way. It's investing directly in people, but it's also investing directly in communities where people are being born into poverty. And then in terms of keeping young people here, you have to be born here to have the bond, and then you have to be a Vermont resident to claim the baby bond. And the uses of the bond sort of tie you back into the Vermont economy. So we think that's a unique policy objective for a state like Vermont that's trying to keep young people here.
Right.
But we need to figure out a path to do that makes it more affordable for them, and to be able to rely on really the market to take that $3,200 and turn it into $20,000, $25,000 by the time that baby becomes an adult. It's sort of what we do with our pension system. We put money aside, we invest it, and then when somebody retires, they're able to live on that retirement from the pension system. Same idea. We're investing taxpayer money, but we're also making sure that taxpayer investment grows so it can have an even bigger impact over time.
That's incredible. And truly life-changing money for many in Vermont.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, you want it to be enough, obviously, so it does make a difference. But I think, having $15,000 or $20,000 to go to school, to start a business, invest in a business, even your first home. We need to build more homes for people so that homes, a down payment can be achieved with, $20,000 or $30,000 or $40,000. It's tougher and tougher and tougher to do in our state. But it's a huge step for an individual that was born into a family circumstance where they don't have the parent or the uncle or the relative that can give them $20,000 to start that idea, that many other people are fortunate enough to have. And that just grows these disparities that we see in our economy. And again, why we're focused on this idea of investing in the middle class, because it's better for the economy to have a strong middle class. It's a more stable economy. It's an economy where a lot more people have opportunity, upward mobility, and even just more broadly, it's important for our democracy to have that kind of an economy so that we don't have the anger and the hate that comes from a lack of economic opportunity. And I think as much of anything that's happened in the last 4 or 5, 6 years, it's that economic disparity that is creating that anger and that backlash to the institutions that we have in this country. So to be even a stable democracy, we really have to focus on this issue of giving people economic opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will be watching closely and wish this pilot program luck.
Yeah, thank you.
If it goes well. I have one more question for you, and then I'll let you get back to your day. So in previous interviews, you have mentioned that you got into public service because of the example that your parents set for you, right? This sort of caring commitment to community. Now, what I find interesting is that while you were growing up, your mother was a Democrat and your father was a Republican, yet your family core values remain so strong.
Yeah.
Such a tight-knit family, from what I hear. I wasn't there, but that's what I'm hearing. And so putting aside the fact that there are some instances where extreme differences can create dangerous sort of environments, acknowledging that, putting it to the side, I'm wondering if you have any advice for how Vermonters can navigate this extremely politically divisive time.
Yeah, well, I think the simplest thing is to keep a relationship and keep conversation going. I think it's so easy, and I am a victim of this or guilty of this myself. So easy to go to our corners and go to the people that we agree with and sort of talk about all the things we agree with each other and sort of talk about how that other side is out of their mind and I can't believe they think that, et cetera, et cetera. But you're not changing anybody's mind, nor are you changing your own mind when you're sort of in that echo chamber. So trying to make sure we continue to reach out to people that we don't agree with, and not just reach out to them, but have conversation about what is it that, why do you feel the way you do? What is this? Why do you have, why, I mean, just even take the president, like, what is it about the president that makes you support him? Why do you not like DEI? What does that mean to you? Try to break down some of these items and try to find more common values that I think we still share, but they get wrapped up in a lot of coded language and a lot of anger. And that's unfortunate because we have so much more in common, not just as Americans, but in terms of our basic humanity. And we should try to encourage that as much as we can.
Yeah, let's find that common ground.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Treasurer Pieciak, thank you so much for your time. I so value it and value all of the work that you're doing. It's truly incredible. I am a huge fan after looking up on all of this stuff. And I so look forward to continuing collaboration with you.
Yeah, same here. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Take care.
Thank you.
And that's our episode. Our sincere gratitude to Treasurer Mike Pieciak for sitting down to talk with us today. If you'd like to learn more about what was discussed, you can visit vermonttreasurer.gov. That's Vermont, fully spelled out, treasurer.gov. Also, don't forget to get on VPIRG's mailing list, follow us on social media, and like, comment, share, subscribe, and rate us 5 stars. If you have questions or ideas for future episodes, reach out to me at jheiden@vpirg.org. That's JHEIDEN@vpirg.org. Finally, a big shout out to my co-producer Elijah Cushion. I'm Jordan Heiden, and you have been listening to Vermont's Voice. Take care and talk soon.